This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I'm joined today by Christian DeBlasio of Purfresh Wine, who is joining us all the way from sunny California. Now, the reason we are speaking today is because the term smoke taint has been repeated over and over again. In fact, it's becoming more and more prevalent, particularly in California and Australia. Smoke taint has become a bit of a hot topic, shall we say. And Christian, with his company, Purfresh Wine, has a solution for that. But I'd like to ask you some questions about smoke taint first, if that's okay, Christian.
That would be great, Jamie.
Super. So it's my understanding that there are about 11 to 13 compounds that can bring about smoke taint. But for the most part, we're talking about guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol. I was wondering, does this variance in compounds change depending upon the type of fire or smoke that is being treated?
That's a great question, and it's a very complex question with some complex answers, as you can imagine. The guaiacol and the 4-methyl-guaiacol pieces of the smoke taint profile that you mentioned are what the industry calls marker smoke taint profiles, which means that of all those 9 to 11 compounds that you referred to, it may not be all of them that actually result in sensory smoke taint in the wine, either in the palate or in the nose. But guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol are suspected to be not even major contributors into the sensory factors that relate to smoke taint wine, but they're markers in a sense, because if you can have your harvested grapes tested to see, do I have smoke taint issues, looking at elevated levels of guaiacol or 4-methyl-guaiacol can tell you whether or not you're dealing with, or you're going to be dealing with smoke taint in your wine.
Now, how does a grape grower test one's grapes to see if they're affected by smoke taint? Because it gets quite complex, whether we're talking about free volatile phenols or glycosylated volatile phenols.
So how would you get them tested? So in most cases, wineries and vineyards would have to send their samples into a laboratory. I would say 90% of winemakers, growers, vineyards around the world would have a local winery. There's very popular, well-known ones in all of the major wine growing regions. Napa, Sonoma area has 2 or 3 of them. British Columbia has their own. Australia has their own. So the local winemakers and vineyards would know which laboratory to send it into. The large wine companies, the Gallos and the Jackson families of the world, they would have their own private in-house laboratories to measure these types of things.
So I think a lot about when the grape is most vulnerable on the vine. At what point in its growing cycle is it most vulnerable? And what impact does the proximity to the fire, for example, or the smoke, the freshness or age of that smoke, and the intensity of that smoke have upon the smoke taint?
The bigger factor in all of this is the veracity of the smoke itself, the proximity to the fire, the actual level of smoke that it's impacted with. That far and beyond is, regardless of the season development of the grape and its growing cycle, the level of smoke and the time of smoke impact is the most important thing. I would say that, to answer your question directly, pre-berry development, if you have a major smoke incidence, it's going to be almost impossible to remove a smoke taint issue. Because if you're providing that plant with heavy smoke taint as the berry's trying to develop, it's just going to be pushing a lot of those biomass burning products, as we call them, into the grape as it grows. So I would say that's, pre-berry is very sensitive, but realistically, if you have a heavy smoke, even on a fully grown berry, for a long period of time, even a few days, it's going to be smoke impacted. But it's fixable if the berry's already been fully developed.
One of the things I found quite fascinating was the difference between these volatile phenols and the glycosylated phenols, and the process of glycosylation, which is almost like a defense mechanism for the grape itself. So the volatile phenols are not found in the pulp of the grape, if my understanding is correct, but found in the skin and not in the waxy layer outside of the skin. But when these compounds are glycosylated, they're absorbed further into the grape so they don't mess up the metabolic process. But then that makes it much more difficult to detect said volatile phenols when they're inside the grape.
It is true. And again, this goes back to your questions on labs. There's different labs with different capabilities, and having a lab that can test the total amount of smoke taint molecules versus the free amount versus the bound amount, which is the amount of smoke taints that are bound to the sugars inside the grapes. These are all different levels. And then having a laboratory that actually can do the glycoside measurements is a whole level up from that. I think to answer your questions answer your question in a practical way, we'll talk about whites and reds. There's a big reason that whites aren't talked about as much with smoke taint issues as reds, and it's because you don't ferment white wines on their skins.
Skin
ferment, and you do so you can see right there, just in that question in itself, most of the smoke taint impacts that we see worldwide with wildfire and climate change that we're seeing around the world is related to the skins. It is related to how much smoke taint they have, how deep it's penetrating into the skin. And then obviously with red wines, the time that the wine is fermenting on the skins, with the ability of that fermentation time to unfortunately release more smoke taint from the skins into the wine. So really it's the measurement of the smoke taint particles on and in the skin that have your biggest impacts on whether your wine is going to be smoke tainted to the point where it's not sellable.
Now, it has become quite a serious problem for some of these grape growers with the wildfires that have been ongoing, especially with some of the more premium Napa vintners who are, they're buying their grapes for about $8,000 a ton. They have now many of them have zero tolerance for any kind of smoke taint whatsoever. So what can these grape growers do to mitigate? And what are the different options available to them if there is smoke taint present in their grapes?
In years past, there have been many different techniques used to try and mitigate or cover or remove smoke taint.
Right.
Most of those techniques have small impact on the final results of what you're trying to do with the wine. There is some good news out there, is that smoke taint is not a light type of issue. You have to have serious smoke in order to have a palate or a sensory taste in the final wine that you make. Most levels of smoke taint for a common consumer would not be recognizable. Most winemakers can notice smoke taint at even low levels. I think that in the world of when do you make decisions on when to treat and not to treat, it really has to do with understanding the science and the type of wine you're using. For example, Pinot Noirs can get impacted by smoke taint much more easily than other types of big red varietals. But I think that in terms of what you can do, there's many types of techniques in the past. Applications of enzymes to the wine, applications of carbon filtering, reverse osmosis. But here's the key behind all of those techniques I just mentioned. They're all techniques to try to mitigate or cover smoke taint after the wine has been made. So your post-fermentation, you actually have wine. It's not must anymore, it's real wine.
Your process is actually pre-crush, right?
Right. Most of those techniques that I've mentioned, in a way, they're messing with the art. That's how I like to refer to them. The winemakers in this day and age are artists. Let's face it, they are. And they have a process and they have an idea. They have a stylistic goal that they're trying to present. The second that you apply enzymes and carbon filtering and reverse osmosis to your wine, you're messing with the artist painting, if you will. The process that our company uses is pre-crush, which makes it very, very different and very much less of a system that's going to play games with the end product that the winemakers are trying to use. At the same time, we're removing and mitigating that smoke taint very, very early on in the winemaking process, which allows the wine to develop as it normally would and end up in the bottle with something that everyone wants to have.